Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we will travel back through the ancient mists of time to explore the vast and quiet journeys of our earliest ancestors as they slowly walked across a shifting world, long before the first cities were built, long before the earliest written words were carved into stone. The earth was a vast and open wilderness of endless plains, deep ancient forests, and rolling mountains. The climate was a slow-breathing living thing, shifting over thousands of years, turning lush green landscapes into dry deserts and back again. In the heart of the African continent, beneath a wide and star-filled sky, small bands of early humans gathered around the warm, flickering glow of campfires. The firelight danced across their faces, providing warmth against the cooling night air and keeping the shadows at bay. These were our ancestors, living quietly in harmony with the rhythms of the seasons, listening to the wind rustle through the tall, dry grass of the savanna. The world was overwhelmingly large, and their footprints were small, yet every step they took laid the foundation for the entirety of human history. As the generations slowly passed, the climate began to subtly change. The rains that once nourished their familiar valleys grew scarce, and the vast herds of animals they followed began to slowly drift outward in search of greener pastures. Our ancestors, bound to the natural world, followed them. They did not run, nor did they rush. They moved at the steady, rhythmic pace of walking, carrying only what they could hold in their hands and on their backs. They carried tools carefully chipped from stone, simple but beautifully functional, shaped by hands that understood the deep nature of the earth. They walked through long valleys, where ancient rivers flowed gently over smooth stones. The sound of the water, a constant, peaceful hum in the background. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth, wild sage, and the occasional sweetness of blooming acacia trees. Every day was a quiet journey, a slow migration driven not by a desire for conquest, but by the simple, beautiful need to survive and find a new home under the vast open sky. They moved in small, close-knit family groups, sharing everything they had. The elders guided them, reading the subtle signs of the landscape, like a map written in the dust and the stars. They knew how to find water hidden beneath the dry riverbeds by observing the flight of birds and the tracks of animals. They taught the young ones how to recognize the edible roots and sweet berries that grew quietly in the underbrush. As the sun began to slowly sink below the horizon each evening, painting the sky in deep hues of purple, orange, and soft pink, they would find a sheltered spot near a rocky outcrop or under the wide branches of an ancient tree. There, they would strike stones together until a tiny spark caught hold in a bed of dry tinder. The fire would grow, crackling softly into the night, casting a circle of golden light. In this warm glow, they would share food, mend their simple garments woven from plant fibers and animal hides, and perhaps hum low, rhythmic melodies that faded into the darkness. The night was peaceful, wrapped in a blanket of silence, broken only by the distant call of an owl, or the wind whispering through the leaves. As they walked further and further over the centuries, they began to encounter landscapes they had never seen before. They crossed wide, flat plains that seemed to stretch into eternity, the grass bowing gently in the wind. They navigated through dense, shadowy forests where the air was cool and smelled of rich, damp earth and ancient moss. They learned to adapt, changing their tools and their habits to suit the new worlds they were slowly discovering. They wrapped themselves in thicker furs as the air grew colder near the mountain passes. They watched with quiet awe as great herds of massive, slow-moving animals grazed in the valleys below. The journey was not measured in miles or days, but in seasons and lifetimes. They were the first explorers moving blindly but bravely into the great unknown, leaving behind nothing but the faint traces of their campfires and the echoes of their footsteps in the dust. And as we leave them resting around their warm fire tonight, preparing for another slow day of walking tomorrow, we recognize the deep, quiet resilience that carried them across the world. When the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, painting the edges of the world in soft shades of silver and pale blue, the camp slowly began to stir. The fire, which had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of red embers during the night, still radiated a gentle warmth against the chill of the early morning air. The elders were the first to wake, stretching their tired limbs and breathing in the crisp, clean scent of the morning dew that clung heavily to the tall grasses. Slowly, the rest of the family group roused from their slumber, wrapped tightly in their warm animal hides. There was no rush, no urgency in their movements. They moved with the quiet grace of people who knew that time was measured only by the journey of the sun across the sky. Carefully, they gathered their few possessions, securing their chipped stone tools and woven baskets. A few of the younger ones gently scraped the remaining embers together, coaxing a small flame to life just long enough to warm the last of the foraged roots from the previous day. The world around them was incredibly still, filled only with the soft sounds of birds beginning their morning songs and the gentle rustle of the wind as the sun finally broke over the distant hills, flooding the landscape with a brilliant, warming golden light. The group set off once again. Their footsteps fell into a steady, rhythmic pattern, a soft crunching of dry earth and gravel that blended seamlessly into the natural symphony of the wild. They walked for hours, guided by the contours of the land, moving toward a distant horizon that seemed to hold endless mysteries. The air began to change subtly as they traveled further. The dry, dusty scent of the savanna slowly gave way to something new, something crisp and slightly sharp. It was the scent of salt, carried on a steady breeze that blew across a landscape that was gradually becoming more rugged and rocky. The soft grasses thinned out, replaced by resilient coastal shrubs that clung tightly to the stony ground. The family group paused on the crest of a high ridge, their eyes widening at the vast, shimmering expanse that lay before them. It was a body of water larger than anything they had ever imagined, stretching out to touch the very edge of the sky. The water was a deep, mesmerizing shade of turquoise, its surface dancing with millions of tiny points of sunlight. Small waves rolled gently onto a shoreline composed of smooth, pale stones, creating a continuous, rhythmic shushing sound that felt incredibly calming. They slowly made their way down the rocky slope toward the water's edge, their bare feet stepping carefully over the sun-warmed stones. The vastness of the sea was overwhelming, yet it offered a strange sense of peace. They found a sheltered cove where the cliffs rose high above them, providing a natural barrier against the wind. Here, the water was shallow and crystal clear, revealing tiny, silver fish darting among patches of vibrant green seaweed. The children, momentarily forgetting the weariness of the long walk, waded into the cool water, their laughter ringing out clearly in the quiet coastal air. They marveled at the smooth shells scattered along the shoreline, picking them up to trace the intricate spirals with their fingers. The adults, too, felt a sense of relief wash over them. They began to explore the tidal pools left behind by the receding water, discovering a rich bounty of shellfish clinging tightly to the dark rocks. With skilled, patient hands, they used their stone tools to gently pry the shells loose, grateful for this unexpected feast provided by the vast blue expanse. The evening settled over the cove with a profound and gentle quietness. They gathered driftwood that had been smoothed and bleached white by the sun and the salt, stacking the pieces carefully in the center of their camp. The process of making fire was a comforting ritual, a familiar sequence of movements that anchored them to the earth, no matter how far they traveled. Soon, a bright, cheerful blaze was dancing against the dark stone of the cliff face, pushing back the gathering twilight. They roasted the shellfish over the open flames, the savory aroma mingling beautifully with the clean, briny smell of the sea air. They sat close together, their shoulders touching, sharing the food in contented silence. Above them, the sky deepened into a magnificent tapestry of indigo and black, pierced by thousands of brilliant, unblinking stars. The ocean, now a dark, vast mystery stretching into the night, whispered continuously to the shore. The soft, rhythmic shush of the water over the smooth stones was a deeply meditative sound, washing away the fatigue of the long journey. As their eyes grew heavy and the fire burned down to a comforting glow, they laid down on the warm sand, wrapping their furs tightly around themselves, lulled into a deep and dreamless sleep by the ancient song of the sea. Days turned into gentle weeks as the family group lingered by the edge of the great water, their lives slowly falling into harmony with the breathing of the ocean. The rhythmic rise and fall of the tides became their new heartbeat, a deeply predictable and comforting cycle that organized their slow, sunlit days. They learned to read the subtle changes in the water, understanding without words that the bright, silver disk of the full moon pulling itself across the night sky brought the water highest upon the shore in the quiet hours of the morning. When the tide retreated far into the distance, it left behind a vast, shimmering landscape of wet sand and hidden tidal pools. The air was always heavy, with a cool, salty mist that left tiny drops of moisture resting softly on their dark hair and eyelashes. They would walk out onto this temporary world, their bare feet sinking slightly into the soft, ribbed sand, guided by the wet reflections of the pale morning sky. The elders showed the younger ones how to gently lift the heavy blankets of dark green kelp to reveal hidden crabs and small, slow-moving sea snails. There was no rush in this gathering, only a quiet, meditative sorting of the ocean's generous offerings, accompanied by the endless, low rumbling of the waves breaking far out on the sandy shoals. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning fog and warming the damp coastal air, they would carry their gathered bounty back to the dry, soft sands above the high water mark. Here, the long, quiet afternoons were spent in careful, patient labor. The tools they had carried from the deep savanna were slowly joined by new implements born of the sea. They learned to shatter the thick, heavy shells of large mollusks, using smooth beach stones to carefully chip away the edges until they formed sharp, curved blades. These shell knives were perfect for slicing the tough stalks of kelp, which they then laid out in the warm sun to dry. As the kelp dried, it transformed from a heavy, rubbery plant into strong, flexible strips that the adults expertly wove and braided together. Their hands moved in a mesmerizing, repetitive rhythm, weaving the seaborne fibers into sturdy baskets and carrying nets. The children sat nearby, drawing wide, sweeping spirals and animal shapes in the wet sand with sticks, watching the patterns slowly melt away as the edges of the incoming tide crept closer. The atmosphere was incredibly peaceful, grounded in the simple, beautiful necessity of making what they needed from the world exactly where they stood. Eventually, the quiet urge to continue their journey returned, not driven by fear or hunger, but by the deep, ancient instinct to see what lay beyond the next curve of the shoreline. They gathered their woven kelp baskets, now heavy with dried fish and fresh water stored in animal skins, and began to walk along the very edge of the continent. They followed the boundary, where the land met the sea, a narrow, winding pathway that offered a clear route through an otherwise dense and impenetrable wilderness. To their right, the vast turquoise ocean stretched out endlessly, while, to their left, thick, ancient forests of towering, moss-draped trees crowded the steep coastal mountains. They walked in single file, their footprints leaving a temporary trail in the wet sand that the ocean faithfully washed clean just hours later. The walking was slow and deliberate, a physical meditation guided by the unending, hypnotic sound of the surf. Sometimes, soft, grey blankets of coastal fog would roll in from the deep water, wrapping the world in a quiet, misty embrace. During these times, the horizon vanished entirely, and they moved purely by the sound of the waves and the feeling of the solid earth beneath their feet, finding deep comfort in the closeness of their small, steady group, as another long, tranquil day of walking gradually came to an end. The fading sunlight cast long, golden shadows across a magnificent coastal landscape. The sandy beach slowly gave way to towering cliffs of dark, jagged stone that reached out into the churning water like ancient fingers. At the base of these massive cliffs, hollowed out by thousands of years of relentless waves, they found a deep, dry cave. The entrance was wide and inviting, offering a perfect shelter from the cool evening wind. They slowly carried their belongings into the sandy interior, grateful for the protective embrace of the stone. The sounds of the ocean changed as they entered, shifting from a wide, roaring wash into a deep, resonant echo that hummed gently against the cave walls. They built their small fire near the entrance, the smoke rising cleanly into the darkening sky. The golden light of the flames flickered against the smooth, curved ceiling of their temporary home, illuminating the tired but peaceful faces of the family. They sat together, listening to the echoing song of the sea, profoundly safe and deeply connected to the endless, beautiful rhythm of the slow migration that was carrying them across the face of the earth. The night spent within the deep embrace of the ancient stone cave was one of profound and undisturbed rest. The thick walls of rock absorbed the chill of the coastal winds, holding on to the gentle warmth of the fire. Long after the embers had faded into soft grey ash, as the first pale hints of morning light crept through the wide entrance, it painted the smooth, curved ceiling in muted tones of charcoal and slate. Outside, the ocean was cloaked in a thick, silent blanket of white sea fog, dampening the sound of the crashing waves into a low, continuous rumble that felt like the breathing of the earth itself. The family group awoke slowly, their bodies deeply refreshed by the safety of the stone shelter. They spoke in hushed, resonant whispers that bounced softly off the cave walls, packing their woven kelp baskets and tying their animal hides tightly against the damp morning air. Stepping out of the cave, they were immediately swallowed by the cool, milky mist. The world was reduced to the few feet of wet, rocky ground immediately in front of them, turning their slow migration into an incredibly intimate journey. They moved close together, a silent procession of shadows, navigating through the cloud that had settled over the coastline. By midday, the thick fog began to lift, tearing away in long, ragged wisps as the sun finally burned through the overcast sky. As the misty veil dissolved, a completely new landscape was slowly revealed to them. They had walked past the jagged cliffs and arrived at the mouth of a massive, slow-moving river that emptied quietly into the sea. The water was a deep, glassy green, a stark contrast to the turbulent turquoise of the ocean. The air here was entirely different, losing the sharp bite of salt and replacing it with the heavy, rich aroma of damp earth, blooming freshwater lilies, and decaying river wood. The elders, reading the subtle currents and the sheer volume of fresh water pouring forth, understood that this mighty river was a path leading deep into the unseen heart of the land. Without a word, they turned their backs to the endless ocean and began to walk inland, following the winding, muddy banks of the great river. The ground beneath their bare feet grew softer, covered in a thick carpet of vibrant green moss and fallen leaves that muffled their footsteps completely. The river valley was a lush, overflowing paradise of life, utterly untouched by the passage of time. Giant ferns with fronds as wide as a person unrolled their spiraling green tips toward the patches of sunlight that pierced the dense, overarching canopy. The air was warm and deeply humid, vibrating with the continuous, soothing chorus of thousands of unseen insects and the melodic calls of brightly colored birds hidden high in the branches above. The family group walked with wide eyes, marveling at the sheer abundance of this new world. They found calm, shallow pools along the river's edge where massive, silver-scaled fish rested motionless in the clear water, their gills pumping slowly. With incredible patience, the adults wove long, narrow traps from the flexible river reeds, placing them gently into the gentle current. Time seemed to slow down completely. In the dappled shade of the riverbank, the children amused themselves by pressing their hands into the soft, grey clay near the water, leaving small, perfect handprints baked by the afternoon sun. As the dense canopy above began to filter the evening light into beams of deep, glowing amber, they sought out a clearing nestled between the enormous, moss-draped roots of an ancient, towering tree. These roots formed natural, high-walled wooden chambers, incredibly dry and sheltered from the humid forest floor. They gathered dry river grass and fallen branches, working together in a quiet, practiced harmony to build their evening fire. The flames cast a warm, dancing light against the rough bark of the giant tree, illuminating the intricate patterns of the wood and the calm, peaceful faces of the family. They dined on the rich, sweet fish caught in their reed traps, the meat tender and cooked perfectly over the hot stones placed at the edge of the fire. The deep, rushing sound of the mighty river provided a constant, heavy lullaby, drowning out the unfamiliar sounds of the deep forest. As darkness fully claimed the valley, they settled deeply into their warm, grassy beds between the sheltering roots, their slow, quiet breathing joining the ancient, rhythmic pulse of the wilderness around them. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the immense, overlapping layers of the forest canopy, casting only a pale, emerald-tinted light into the deep, wooden chamber where the family slept. The air was incredibly still, holding the cool, damp breath of the river and the rich, earthy scent of ancient, decaying wood. Slowly, the elders opened their eyes, listening to the unchanging, heavy rush of the water just a short distance away. There was a profound comfort in waking up, surrounded by the solid, unyielding walls of the giant roots. A feeling of being safely cradled by the earth itself. They rose with the gentle, deliberate movements of those who have no concept of rushing, untangling their limbs from the soft piles of dry river grass. The younger members of the group rubbed the sleep from their eyes, stretching their arms toward the intricate wooden ceiling. They walked down to the muddy riverbank, the cool mud squishing softly between their bare toes. The reed traps they had set the evening before bobbed gently in the current, heavy with the weight of silver-scaled fish. With quiet, practiced efficiency, they pulled the traps from the water, their hands moving in perfect, wordless coordination, grateful for the continuous abundance the river provided. After a simple morning meal, they secured their belongings and continued their slow walk upstream. The character of the river began to change as they traveled deeper into the heart of the continent. The wide, slow-moving expanse of glassy green water gradually narrowed, picking up speed as it flowed over hidden rocks and submerged logs. The muddy banks gave way to solid shelves of smooth, water-worn stone, making their progress easier but requiring careful, deliberate steps. The forest around them seemed to grow even older and denser. The trees here were unimaginably tall, their massive trunks covered in thick layers of spongy, vibrant green moss that absorbed every sound, turning the valley into a quiet, heavily muffled sanctuary. High above, the wind rustled the leaves, but down on the forest floor, the air was perfectly still and heavy, with the scent of blooming orchids and wet ferns. They walked in a single line along the stone shelves, their eyes constantly scanning the dense undergrowth, not for danger, but for the quiet, hidden gifts the forest might offer. By midday, the bright, dappled sunlight, filtering through the leaves, began to fade, replaced by a soft, uniform grey light. The air grew intensely humid, and a deep, resonant rumble echoed through the valley, vibrating gently against their chests. It was the familiar, comforting sound of approaching rain. They did not run for cover, for the rain was a natural part of their world, a cleansing embrace from the sky. They simply moved beneath the incredibly wide, umbrella-like leaves of a cluster of giant ferns growing near the water's edge. The rain began to fall in heavy, warm drops, hitting the leaves above them with a rhythmic, deeply relaxing patter. The sound grew into a steady, overwhelming drumming, a magnificent white noise that drowned out the river and wrapped them in a cocoon of sound. The dry earth around them darkened instantly, releasing a powerful, intoxicating perfume of wet dust, crushed leaves, and blooming life. They sat closely together beneath their green canopy, their animal hides absorbing the stray drops, watching the river's surface erupt into millions of tiny, dancing splashes. The children reached out their hands, letting the warm rainwater collect in their palms, drinking the pure, sweet water with quiet delight. The rain was a brief, beautiful interlude, a rhythmic meditation that washed the world clean and left the forest sparkling with heavy, diamond-like water droplets clinging to every leaf and branch. The air felt incredibly fresh, light, and easy to breathe, filled with the vibrant energy of the nourished earth. As the late afternoon sun broke back through the thinning clouds, turning the dripping forest into a glowing, golden paradise, they reached a gentle bend in the river. Here, the water tumbled over a series of wide, shallow rock steps, creating a low, cascading waterfall that filled the air with a soothing, continuous rushing sound. The water flowed over the smooth stones like liquid glass, creating soft, white foam where it pooled at the bottom. Adjacent to these gentle rapids, the stone shelf widened into a flat, dry terrace, covered in soft, springy moss that felt like a thick, natural woven blanket. It was an idyllic place to rest. The elders set down their heavy woven baskets, their faces softening with relief as they stretched their tired shoulders. The children immediately ran to the shallow pools formed at the base of the cascade, splashing the cool, fresh water over their faces and arms, their soft laughter mingling with the sound of the flowing river. The adults slowly gathered fallen branches that had been dragged down by the river and left to dry on the sun-warmed rocks, building a modest pile on the mossy terrace. The rhythmic striking of flint against stone echoed faintly over the sound of the waterfall until a bright, cheerful fire leaped into life, its golden light pushing back the gathering shadows of the deep forest. As night fell, the heavy canopy above trapped the warmth of the fire, creating a cozy, perfectly sheltered haven. They lay down upon the soft moss, resting their heads on their folded animal hides. The deep, constant roar of the cascading water, pulling them gently down into a long, restorative sleep. The endless rush of the cascading water provided a heavy, unbroken curtain of sound that held the family in a deep, restorative slumber long after the sun had begun to lighten the eastern sky. When they finally stirred, the air resting over the mossy terrace carried a new, unfamiliar crispness. The heavy, clinging humidity of the deep, lower forest had been washed away by the night, replaced by a cool, thin breeze that drifted down from the higher elevations. The elders sat up slowly, breathing deeply, their chests expanding as they took in the sharp, clean scent of crushed stone and fresh, cold water. There was no urgency to leave their soft, springy beds of moss. They spent the early morning hours lingering by the edge of the crystal-clear pools formed at the base of the waterfall, washing their faces and hands in the freezing, invigorating water. They broke their fast with the remaining dried fish, chewing slowly while watching the morning light dance and shatter across the surface of the rushing river. The world felt vast and incredibly pure, untouched by anything save the gentle hands of time and the slow, relentless shaping of water against rock. When they finally gathered their woven baskets and simple stone tools, they noticed that the path ahead was beginning to rise steadily. The flat, water-worn stone shelves they had followed the previous day slowly transformed into a rising, uneven staircase of massive boulders and ancient bedrock. They climbed with careful, deliberate steps, their tough, bare feet gripping the rough, dry stone with practiced ease. The river, which had been a wide and lazy companion, now roared with a concentrated energy, cutting deeply through a narrowing gorge of dark, grey stone. The climb was physically demanding, yet they moved at an unhurried, rhythmic pace, stopping frequently to rest upon flat boulders and listen to the echoing roar of the water, trapped between the sheer rock walls. As they ascended, the dense, broad-leafed canopy of the lower forest gradually thinned, allowing brilliant shafts of unobstructed sunlight to strike the damp stone, creating shimmering, temporary rainbows in the mist kicked up by the churning rapids below. By the time the sun reached its highest point, pouring a brilliant, warming light into the canyon, the landscape underwent a profound and beautiful transformation. The dark, towering walls of the gorge began to widen and fall away, and the steep, rocky incline gently leveled out. The family stepped up onto the edge of a magnificent, high-altitude plateau. The heavy, damp scent of the river valley was entirely replaced by the incredibly sharp, sweet perfume of sun-baked pine needles and wild mountain sage. Before them stretched an endless, rolling expanse of tall, golden grasses that swayed and rippled like a vast ocean under the push of a cool, steady wind. Dotted across this golden sea were solitary, wind-twisted evergreen trees, their dark green branches stark against the incredibly deep, unbroken blue of the high mountain sky. In the far distance, scraping the very edge of the heavens, stood a jagged line of massive mountains, their peaks gleaming bright white with eternal snow. The sheer scale of the open space was breathtaking, bringing a profound sense of peace and stillness to the travelers who had spent so long beneath the heavy, enclosing roof of the deep forest. They walked out into the sea of golden grass, their legs brushing softly against the dry stalks, creating a continuous, hushing whisper that harmonized perfectly with the steady wind. The air here was noticeably colder as the afternoon wore on, prompting them to pull their thick animal hides tighter around their shoulders. They found a shallow, bowl-like depression in the earth, sheltered from the persistent wind by a semicircle of sturdy, low-hanging pine branches. The ground here was naturally padded with generations of fallen, rust-colored pine needles, incredibly soft and fragrant. The younger members of the group scattered to collect the dry, brittle deadwood snapped from the trees by winter storms, returning to build their fire in the center of the shallow basin. As the sun dipped below the golden horizon, painting the vast sky in shocking shades of deep violet and bruised orange, the sweet-smelling pine fire crackled to life. The heat was deeply comforting against the mountain chill. They huddled close together, watching the sparks fly upward to join an emerging canopy of stars that burned with an intense, icy brilliance in the thin, clear air, surrounded by the scent of pine and the endless song of the wind in the high grass. They fell into a quiet, peaceful sleep. The frost of the high-altitude night had settled heavily over the plateau, painting the ends of the golden grass and the edges of the pine branches in a delicate, sparkling rim of white ice. When the early humans finally opened their eyes, their breath rose in soft, rhythmic clouds of white vapor against the freezing morning air. The world was suspended in an icy stillness, broken only by the distant, high-pitched call of a soaring eagle. They did not rush to leave the warmth of their thick animal hides and the deep bed of rust-colored pine needles. Instead, they watched in quiet awe as the first rays of the rising sun struck the distant, snow-capped mountain peaks, setting the jagged ice on fire with brilliant shades of bright pink and glowing gold. Slowly, the warm light spilled down the steep mountain slopes and washed over the vast ocean of grass, melting the frost into millions of tiny, shimmering drops of water. The group finally stood, stretching their stiff muscles, and rubbed their hands together to restore the circulation. The fire had died down to a circle of cold, grey ash, so they gathered their woven baskets and simple stone tools, preparing to step out from the shelter of the twisted pines and into the endless open space of the high steppe. Walking across the plateau was vastly different from navigating the tangled roots of the deep forest or the uneven rocks of the river Gorge. The ground here was relatively flat and firm, covered in a thick, resilient mat of roots and dry soil that made their footsteps incredibly quiet. The golden grass grew as high as their waists, parting easily as they pushed through, creating a continuous, soft, rustling sound that became the steady rhythm of their journey. The sky above them felt impossibly large, a flawless dome of deep, piercing azure stretching from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. They followed deep, narrow trails that had been worn into the earth by countless generations of migrating animals, guided by an instinctive trust in the paths laid down by the wild. The wind was a constant companion, a cool, invisible force that swept steadily across the open space, carrying the faint, dry scents of distant dust and sun-baked earth. The sheer emptiness of the landscape was deeply meditative, allowing their minds to drift into a state of calm, walking hypnosis as they moved beneath the bright, high-altitude sun. As they crested a long, gentle swell in the rolling earth, the elders at the front of the line suddenly stopped, raising a hand in a silent gesture of stillness. The rest of the family group crouched low into the concealing cover of the tall golden grass, their eyes wide with quiet wonder. Filling the shallow valley below them was a massive, slow-moving herd of immense, shaggy beasts. They were ancient steppe mammoths, creatures of unimaginable size and power, their thick, dark, reddish-brown coats hanging down in long, matted dreadlocks that brushed the ground. Enormous, curving ivory tusks swept forward from their massive heads, catching the afternoon sunlight. The humans did not feel fear, only a deep, respectful reverence for these walking mountains. The air vibrated with the heavy, subsonic rumbling of the herd communicating, a sound that resonated deep within the chests of the watchers. They sat in the grass for hours, completely captivated, watching the giant animals peacefully strip the tough grass with their trunks and slowly trudge across the valley floor, their massive feet kicking up small, glowing clouds of golden dust. It was a beautiful, humbling reminder of their own small place within a vast, living world. As the shadows grew incredibly long, stretching across the plateau like dark, thin fingers, the great herd slowly disappeared over the far horizon, leaving behind a profound silence. The family group rose from their hiding place and continued their journey until they found an enormous, solitary boulder of smooth grey granite resting inexplicably in the middle of the grassy sea, dropped there by a vanished glacier thousands of years ago. The massive stone provided a perfect, solid windbreak against the cooling evening air. With trees nowhere to be found, they spread out to gather tough, dry bundles of sagebrush and the sun-baked, fibrous dung left behind by the migrating herds. Returning to the base of the ancient grey stone, they struck their flints with patient, practiced hands until a small, intensely hot fire took hold. The burning sage filled the air with a thick, beautifully aromatic smoke that cleansed the camp and kept the mountain insects at bay. They huddled against the sun-warmed surface of the great boulder, pulling their thick hides tight, completely exhausted but deeply contented. As the sky transitioned from pale orange to a magnificent, deep velvet black, dotted with countless brilliant stars, the slow, rhythmic breathing of the family joined the endless song of the wind sweeping across the open plateau, carrying them into a profound and restful sleep. The dawn arrived, not with a sudden burst of light, but with a slow, creeping illumination that gently peeled back the heavy velvet darkness of the high steppe. The immense, solitary granite boulder against which they had rested remained pleasantly cool against their backs, acting as a quiet, solid anchor in the vast, whispering sea of golden grass. As the family group awoke, their movements were perfectly synchronized with the sluggish, unhurried pace of the waking earth. There was no sudden urgency to rise, only a calm and collective awareness that the resting time had ended and the walking time had returned. They stretched their limbs out into the crisp, thin morning air, taking deep, slow breaths that filled their chests with the clean scent of dry dust and lingering sage smoke. Slowly and methodically, they packed their woven kelp baskets and tied their heavy animal hides around their waists, leaving the remains of their small ash circle to be scattered perfectly by the wind. They stepped away from the great stone and resumed their quiet march toward the horizon, guided by the subtle, imperceptible downward tilt of the land. For days, they walked across the gradually descending plateau, a steady, rhythmic migration that felt entirely detached from the passage of time. As they moved lower, the constant, biting wind of the high altitude began to soften, losing its harsh edge and turning into a gentle, playful breeze. The endless sea of tall, golden grass slowly gave way to patches of rich, dark earth, covered in low, creeping green vines and sweet-smelling mountain wildflowers that nodded quietly in the breeze. The air grew heavier, losing the sharp, dry crispness of the steppe, and taking on a deeply refreshing, damp quality that spoke of abundant hidden water. They followed the natural depressions in the landscape, walking along the dry beds of ancient, seasonal streams until the smooth grey pebbles beneath their feet grew dark with moisture. Soon the faintest sound of trickling water reached their ears, a delicate musical chiming that seemed to rise directly from the stones themselves. They followed this beautiful sound until the narrow stream bed opened up dramatically, revealing a breathtaking new world hidden in the hollow of the descending mountains. Spread out before them was an immense, ancient wetland, a sprawling network of crystal clear, glacial lakes connected by winding, slow-moving streams. The water was perfectly still in the sheltered valley, mirroring the vast blue sky and the surrounding green hills with an incredibly flawless clarity. Surrounding the lakes were dense, towering walls of bright green reeds that rustled continuously, a soft, papery sound that filled the entire valley. But what completely captivated the family group was the overwhelming abundance of life. The sky above the wetlands was filled with massive, swirling flocks of migratory birds, thousands upon thousands of geese, swans, and long-legged herons descending upon the lakes in a beautiful, chaotic symphony of calls and beating wings. The early humans stood at the edge of the water, their eyes wide and deeply bright, completely mesmerized by the sheer volume of the wild chorus. The air smelled incredibly sweet, a thick, rich perfume of blooming water lilies, crushed green reeds, and deep, fertile mud. They waded gently into the shallow, sun-warmed water at the edge of the lake, letting the soft mud squeeze between their tired toes, feeling an immediate, profound sense of arrival and relief. They decided to make their camp on a gently sloping grassy bank that overlooked the largest of the crystal-clear lakes. The afternoon was spent in a state of quiet, focused gathering. The elders waded slowly through the dense reeds, their hands moving with incredible gentleness as they collected fallen bird feathers and the large, pale blue eggs left behind in abandoned nests. The children scoured the muddy banks, discovering the massive, beautiful shed antlers of great deer that had come to drink at the water's edge. Bringing these treasures back to the grassy bank, the adults sat cross-legged in the warm afternoon sun, beginning a slow, meticulous process of creation. Using their sharpest stone flakes, they carefully scored and snapped the tough antlers, patiently grinding the bone against smooth river rocks, until they formed thin, incredibly sharp needles and delicately curved fishing hooks. There was no rushing the stone against the bone, only a steady, rhythmic scratching sound that blended perfectly with the calls of the birds. As evening approached, casting a magnificent, glowing golden light across the mirrored surface of the lakes, they built a small fire of dried reeds. They roasted the gathered eggs and the sweet, starchy roots pulled from the marsh, sharing the quiet feast, while the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The nighttime chorus of the wetland was a constant, soothing lullaby of croaking frogs and the soft splashes of night-feeding birds, wrapping the family in a blanket of natural sound as they fell into a deeply peaceful, unbroken sleep beside the ancient water. The thick, silvery mist of the wetland morning clung heavily to the surface of the glassy lake, turning the entire valley into a deeply mysterious world of muted greys and soft, diffuse light. The family group awoke slowly to the rhythmic, hollow dripping of dew falling from the towering green reeds onto the soft mud below. The air was incredibly cool and saturated with the clean, raw scent of fresh water and wet earth. They did not speak, moving instead with a quiet, shared understanding that belonged to the waking landscape. They sat on their damp hides, watching the mist slowly swirl and part as the invisible sun began to warm the upper atmosphere. The water was perfectly still, an unbroken mirror that doubled the pale morning sky, disturbed only occasionally by the gentle, circular ripples of a rising fish, or the silent glide of a lone white swan cutting through the fog. It was a morning of absolute peace, a time suspended in the gentle breathing of the marsh. As the sun finally burned through the heavy mist, casting a brilliant, warming light across the vast network of lakes, the family turned their attention to the delicate tools they had carved from bone the day before. The elders brought out bundles of long, tough plant stalks they had collected from the edges of the marsh. With incredible patience, they peeled away the outer skins, exposing the strong, inner fibers. They rolled these fibers against their bare thighs, twisting and braiding them together with practiced, rhythmic motions until they formed long, beautifully thin cords that were surprisingly strong. Carefully, they bound their newly crafted, delicately curved bone hooks to the ends of these cords, securing them with tight, complex knots. They waded slowly into the shallow, sun-warmed edges of the lake, their movements so smooth and deliberate that they barely caused a ripple. They cast their simple lines out over the dark water and settled into a state of profound stillness, becoming completely indistinguishable from the silent, watching herons that stood nearby. The act of waiting was a deep meditation, a merging of their own slow heartbeats with the timeless rhythm of the water. The patience of the early humans was generously rewarded by the abundant depths of the wetland. When the lines grew heavy, they pulled them in with steady hand-over-hand motions, bringing flashing, silver-scaled fish up from the green waters. Recognizing that this bounty could carry them far on their continuing journey, they began the slow, careful process of preservation. The children gathered thin, flexible branches of green willow and sweet gum from the edges of the forest, bringing them back to the grassy bank. The adults constructed a low, woven frame over their fire pit, arranging the green wood specifically to produce a thick, fragrant smoke rather than high heat. They laid the cleaned fish over the frame, allowing the thick, grey smoke to slowly dry and cure the meat. The rich, deeply savoury aroma of smoking fish mingled beautifully with the earthy scent of the burning willow, filling the camp with a smell of immense comfort and security. For days, they tended this low, smouldering fire, watching the fish turn a deep, beautiful golden brown, knowing that the lake's gift would sustain them through the unknown landscapes that lay ahead. Weeks drifted by in a haze of golden afternoons and deeply peaceful, star-filled nights, but slowly the subtle language of the earth began to change. The wind that swept across the wetlands shifted, carrying a new, sharper chill that whispered of distant ice and turning seasons. The massive flocks of birds that had filled the lakes with their chaotic songs began to gather in the sky, forming immense, shifting V-shapes that pointed toward the southern horizon. Their calls, once a sound of arrival, now became a haunting, beautiful farewell as they rode the shifting currents away. The family group felt the deep, ancestral pull to follow the changing winds. They packed their woven baskets, now heavy with the deeply cured, golden brown fish, and carefully tied their thick animal hides securely against the growing chill. They stood one last time on the grassy bank, looking out over the mirrored water that had sheltered them so completely. With a quiet, shared sigh, they turned their backs to the lakes and began to walk toward the rolling, blue-tinted hills that marked the far edge of the valley, their footsteps falling once again into the timeless, steady rhythm of the endless migration. The rolling, blue-tinted hills that had seemed so distant slowly rose to meet their steady footsteps, transforming from soft shapes on the horizon into massive, ancient ridges of dark stone and hardy, low-growing brush. The journey upwards was a gradual, sweeping climb. With every passing day, the air grew noticeably thinner and held a sharp, biting crispness that spoke of the approaching winter. The gentle, playful breezes of the wetland had been entirely replaced by strong, sweeping winds that rushed down from the unseen peaks, carrying the faint, metallic scent of snow and freezing stone. The family group pulled their thick animal, hides tighter across their chests, securing them with intricately knotted belts of woven kelp and plant fiber. They walked close together, a tight cluster of warmth, moving steadily through the cooling world. The ground beneath their bare and calloused feet shifted from soft, damp earth to a dry, loose shale that clattered softly with every step, a hollow, rhythmic clicking that became the new heartbeat of their migration. As they climbed higher into the ancient foothills, the vibrant greens and rich golds of the lower valleys faded into a stark, beautiful palette of muted greys, deep browns, and the pale, dusty green of tough mountain scrub. The trees here did not reach for the sky. Instead, they were gnarled and twisted, bowing low to the ground, in a quiet, eternal submission to the relentless mountain winds. The family walked beneath the shelter of these bent trees, their hands occasionally brushing the rough, grey bark. The silence of the highlands was profound. The chaotic, joyful chorus of the wetlands was just a memory now, replaced by the deep, whistling breath of the wind, passing through the narrow canyons, and the occasional, sharp cry of a mountain hawk, circling high above in the pale, overcast sky. The sun, when it managed to break through the thick, grey clouds, offered a weak, watery light that illuminated the rugged landscape in flat, silvery tones. Yet, there was a deeply comforting rhythm to this harsh beauty, a reminder that the earth was simply shifting into its long, quiet slumber by the time the afternoon light began to fail, transforming the grey sky into a heavy canvas of dark slate. The air temperature plummeted sharply. The first delicate flakes of snow began to fall, drifting down from the heavy clouds with a lazy, hypnotic slowness. The early humans paused in their march, their faces turned upward to watch the white flakes spin and dance in the quiet air. The children reached out, their eyes wide with quiet wonder, catching the freezing stars on their eyelashes and outstretched palms, laughing softly as the ice instantly melted against their warm skin. The snow did not fall in a violent storm, but in a gentle, continuous blanket that slowly began to soften the hard edges of the rocky landscape. The world around them was being painted white, flake by flake, transforming the harsh terrain into a smooth, silent dreamscape. They knew they needed to find shelter before the deep cold of the mountain night fully set in, and the elders scanned the steep, rising walls of the canyon they were following, their experienced eyes searching for the welcoming darkness of a natural recess. They found a deep, sloping overhang of dark, layered shale carved out by an ancient, long-vanished glacier. It was not as deep as a true cave, but the heavy rock roof jutted out far enough to completely block the falling snow and the worst of the biting wind. They gathered dry, brittle branches from the gnarled mountain scrub, carrying the wood into the dry shadow of the overhang. As the snowfall outside thickened into a heavy, silent curtain of white, they struck their flints, coaxing a bright, aggressively warm fire to life. The golden light pushed violently against the creeping darkness and the cold, casting dancing, elongated shadows on the layered shale walls. They huddled as close to the flames as they dared, retrieving the golden brown, smoke-cured fish they had carried from the wetlands. The rich, savory meat was a perfect, deeply satisfying comfort against the mountain chill. Outside their shelter, the world was entirely consumed by the quiet, rushing sound of falling snow, burying the landscape in a deep, freezing slumber. Safe within their small circle of heat and light, surrounded by the towering, silent mountains, the family fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep, their bodies resting deeply, while the wild earth outside underwent its frozen transformation. The heavy, dreamless sleep held the family in its quiet embrace until the cold finally began to creep through their thick animal hides. When the elders slowly opened their eyes, they were greeted by a world that had been completely transformed. The dark, layered shale of the overhang still provided a dry, safe haven, but the landscape outside was unrecognizable. The gentle, continuous snowfall of the previous night had buried the rough, muted grays and deep browns of the mountain foothills under an unimaginably thick, pristine blanket of blinding white. The sky had cleared completely, leaving a flawless, piercingly bright blue dome overhead. The morning sun, reflecting brilliantly off millions of untouched ice crystals, cast a glowing, almost magical light into their shallow rock shelter. The profound silence of the mountain had deepened, the heavy snow absorbing every stray sound and reducing the world to a hushed, breathtaking stillness. They sat up slowly, their breath immediately turning into thick white clouds in the freezing air, their eyes wide as they took in the overwhelming purity of the frozen earth. Before stepping out into the deep snow, they knew they had to protect themselves from the biting cold. They untied the extra layers of tough, dried animal skins from their woven kelp baskets. With practiced, careful movements, they wrapped these heavy hides tightly around their lower legs and bare feet, securing them with lengths of thick, braided plant fiber. These simple, ingenious coverings would serve as vital insulation against the freezing moisture. When they finally stepped out from beneath the protective shadow of the rock overhang, their feet sank deep into the soft, powdery snow, leaving a trail of deep, blue-shadowed holes behind them. The cold was immediate and sharp, but the physical exertion of pushing through the knee-deep drifts quickly warmed their bodies. They walked in a single, tight line, the strongest of the adults, taking the lead to break the trail, carefully choosing the safest path up the slowly rising incline. The children followed directly in the freshly made footsteps, stepping precisely where the adults had stepped, saving their energy for the long, arduous climb ahead. The ascent toward the mountain pass was the most demanding challenge they had faced since leaving the deep forest so many seasons ago. The air grew thinner with every step, forcing them to breathe deeply and slowly, their chests heaving in a synchronized rhythmic labor. The only sounds in the immense, frozen landscape were the heavy, crunching steps of their hide-wrapped feet sinking into the snow and the ragged, steady sound of their own breathing. There was no wind, only a silent, crystalline stillness that made the surrounding peaks seem incredibly close and sharp. The sun continued its slow arc across the brilliant blue sky, warming their faces and shoulders, creating a strange but beautiful contrast between the freezing snow below and the gentle heat above. They rested often, finding temporary relief against the sun-warmed surfaces of massive, dark boulders that had managed to shed their snowy blankets. They did not speak, reserving all their strength for the climb, communicating only through soft, encouraging touches on the shoulder and shared, determined glances. As the afternoon light began to take on, a deeper golden hue, the steep, relentless incline finally began to level out. The towering peaks of jagged, ice-covered rock that had framed their path slowly spread apart, revealing a wide, saddle-shaped depression between the highest mountains. They had reached the apex of the great pass. The strongest elder, completely exhausted, but driven by a deep, ancient instinct, took the final few steps through the deep snow and stood at the very edge of the descent. The rest of the family slowly joined them, their tired legs trembling slightly as they gathered together. What they saw below them completely erased the exhaustion from their minds. Spread out far beneath the frozen mountain peaks was a massive, sprawling valley, completely free of the deep snow. Plumes of white steam rose lazily from the valley floor, revealing a network of natural, bubbling hot springs that kept the earth warm and green even in the dead of winter. It was a hidden sanctuary, a perfect, protected world, waiting patiently for them at the end of their long, freezing journey. They stood in the deep snow of the mountain pass, the golden sunlight washing over their faces, deeply, profoundly grateful for the stunning, untouched home that lay quietly below. The descent from the high, frozen pass was a slow and gentle unraveling of winter. With every step down into the sheltering bowl of the valley, the heavy, biting chill of the high peaks was left further behind, replaced by a soft, rising warmth that felt like a physical embrace. The deep, powdery snow that had clung so fiercely to the mountain heights began to thin, giving way to patches of dark, wet earth and resilient alpine moss that drank eagerly from the melting ice. The family moved with a renewed, quiet energy, their eyes drawn to the gentle, rising columns of white vapor that marked the geothermal springs dotting the valley floor. The air shifted dramatically, losing the sharp, sterile scent of frozen stone and filling instead with the earthy, slightly sweet perfume of damp soil, warm mineral water, and the ancient, enduring green of the valley's secluded flora. It was a completely isolated paradise, locked away from the harshness of the changing world outside, a secret cradle of warmth held safely in the palms of the surrounding mountains. When they finally reached the valley floor, they paused to untie the heavy, snow-soaked animal skins from their weary feet, dropping the frozen wrappings onto the soft, unfrozen ground. The sensation of the bare earth against their skin was deeply grounding, a return to the natural connection they had fostered since their very first steps on the distant, sun-baked savanna. They walked slowly toward the largest of the steaming springs, completely mesmerized by the crystal-clear water that bubbled gently from the dark, smooth stones below. The heat radiating from the pool was an incredible comfort, seeping into their tired bones and relaxing muscles that had been tense for days. The children, shedding their heavy outer hides, sat at the edge of the shallow, terraced pools, dipping their hands and feet into the delightfully warm water, their quiet laughter echoing softly through the mist. The elders, finding dry, sun-warmed rocks positioned perfectly around the main spring, sat with their eyes closed, breathing deeply and letting the profound peace of the sanctuary wash over them. As the sun began its final descent, the shadows in the valley grew long and deeply blue. But the geothermal warmth kept the evening chill entirely at bay. They did not need to build a fire to push back the dark, for the glowing warmth of the earth itself was enough. They gathered their remaining provisions, the last of the smoked fish and the sweet roots they had carried across the world, sharing a quiet, final meal beside the steaming water. The journey, with all its vast, sweeping landscapes, its profound challenges, and its quiet, beautiful moments, had finally come to an end. The stars emerged one by one in the dark, framed by the jagged silhouettes of the sheltering mountains, reflecting brilliantly in the still, warm pools of the valley. The early humans lay down upon the soft, warm earth, the gentle, rhythmic bubbling of the hot springs providing a continuous, deeply soothing lullaby. They closed their eyes, profoundly safe and perfectly at rest, their long migration finally woven into the silent, eternal history of the earth.